A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to HJN Super Graphics. So, I feel like we're pretty much on the final stretch of things here, and I feel like that 5 more games will probably be worth talking about here. For number 2629, I'm going to be focusing on another zombies related game. And I have a good amount of things to talk about based on such titles like Dead Island, Dead Rising, Resident Evil. But why don't we go on ahead and take a bit of a stand that took place because of a man known as Chris Condon. He was not only the co-founder of Con Artist Games, but also set upon himself as a popular producer of zombie-based survival games. Most famously, from 2007 to 2009, came along the Last Stand trilogy. The Last Stand, of course, follows Survivors. Survivors, of course, let you play as, whether they are pre-made or you can, in fact, create your own, as these are, in fact, labeled as RPG titles. But at first, it wasn't exactly as complex as how it is today. Basically speaking, Union City is known as the last known venue of the supposed world of the game's location that happens to serve as the safe haven for any and all survivors clinging onto life from the eyes of the zombie apocalypse. Yeah, so unlike with most of the other zombie related games, this one is more about getting to the final destination. Obviously not to be confused with the Final Destination films, but The Last Stand is more or less based on trying to make your way over there in one piece. And by the time that you even get to Union City, it still happens to be a bit of a not so great occasion. However, for The Last Stand Aftermath, which is, believe it or not, the 5th game in the series, as a 4th game known as Dead Zone came around in between Union City and Aftermath's release. While Dead Zone is not exactly as canon as the others, as it does take place after Union City, but doesn't exactly trail off to anything that would have led up to Aftermath. Supposedly Aftermath is something that takes place 15 years after the events of Union City, which is appropriate enough given the fact that Union City came out in 2009, but for The Last Stand Aftermath, that came out in 2021, which was only 12 years apart. So I guess that's good enough, even by our standards here. But here's the thing though, The Last Stand Aftermath is still a bit of a different story when you think about how it works compared to most other titles here. It's considered a roguelike. And I've talked a bit about roguelikes before, like Hellboy Web of Weird, for instance, in which that whenever you die in a certain part of the game, you end up going back to the very beginning. The supposed safe haven, in which that case was the mansion, which was known as the headquarters of operations for Hellboy's team. But for The Last Stand Aftermath, a small compound of Union City is in fact made as the final leg of the journey for any survivors still around, even as the apocalypse is still raging on. The thing is, though, is that this compound is deemed a starting point for all events of The Last Stand entirely. And the way I see it, this roguelike is basically a bit different than most of the others. But it still does follow the same old tradition. You go out there from the starting point, try to get out as far as possible, try to uncover as much as you can, report back to base on occasion via radios, grab a hold of items and weapons of any sort, get your ride fueled up on occasion, make some repairs, get some healing done, as well as put together whatever else kind of things you might need to do as well. The thing is, though, while this is in fact a decent game based on the fact that it's an overhead sort of game with a somewhat 3D-like perspective, you don't exactly get much of certain things out there. I guess one thing that I could mention here is that while the game is somewhat average, being a zombie-based game with shooting capabilities as well as RPG elements in a way, because while this is mostly roguelite, there's also some RPG elements in there. Like, for example, you can make some upgrades and some improvements over the course of your journey. And like I said, every time you die out there, you have to start from the very beginning as a different survivor, basically. And every time you spawn as a different survivor, you have to start off with a different loadout And while sometimes they can be upgraded in different ways, this all depends on how much progress you made in the previous run. And with every run that you make, there's a good variety of different things that you can uncover, certain discoveries which can lead to different weapons being put together at the compound. For every time you start a new run, you can actually get better weapons over time. And on top of that, there's also other things that you can work with as well. Not just weapons, but there's also some items that you can bring along with you. There is, of course, a special repellent for the zombie infection that takes place. And while there are occasionally some fungus-like elements in the game that can, in fact, subject you to certain virus strandings, they basically up your ability of infection. And while the risk may be greatly increased by these certain elements in the game, the repellent will actually help to erase them, or at least make them so they don't get worse. Sometimes this can also allow your health bar to lower as well, which is a really bad situation that you do not want to end up in. And depending on how far into the game you've got, there are certain destinations that you can travel. Of course, the main thing to worry about is that the overall map screen does showcase all the different locations you can visit. There's a good time limit to each of these pieces, and there's also a good amount of fuel that will be needed in order to make your way over to these destinations in particular. They can be certain suburban areas, grocery stores, gas stations, other abandoned locations, entire military compounds and processing bases. Basically a good number of different things that have since been left behind, thanks to the undead overrunning these locations. And while the car, of course, does not have good performance in it at all, that's the main thing about the game. You have to constantly make stops in order to grab fuel for the car, as well as find out whatever other things that you might need to take with you. And it can be anything: weapons, items, healing. And there's even a good amount of different objects that you can pick up as well, some of which may be necessary for either crafting things or even to be brought back to the compound for further analysis. Like I've said, with the more runs that I've made, the more that I've been able to get over time. And I was even able to start off at a point where, let's say, if I gotten really far in one particular run that I got some really good weapons on, but ended up losing them because I died, I was actually able to start off much later into the game, and one run in particular, I actually got some amazing weapons. Sometimes, though, these weapons are only around for a limited time, which is not a great thing to have, the way I see it. But hey, you know what, though? That's the thing about roguelites. The better at the game that you are, then the more rewards that you'll have. You'll have more benefits as time goes on. So I feel like that it just offsets all the sheer frustrations of having to constantly go back to the beginning and start all over again. But here's the main thing, though. The main story goal in the end is to, in fact, get in contact. While I didn't necessarily beat the game, I can at least say that getting in contact is the overall end goal here. Because on the very other side of the map, there actually happens to be a communications tower there. Meaning, the end goal is to get from point A, Union City's own compound, to point B, a large communications array, which is supposedly going to be used as a means of getting in contact, possibly with the outside world. Yeah, other parts of the world may definitely be needing your help. There's always a good chance that cooperation may be involved as well. But since I have not beat the game, it's probably not going to be done. Or at least not going to be known. But let's be real here. The concept itself is rather simple to do, but with all these different things that are happening, all these conflicting actions that happen, all these stops needing to be made to occasionally refuel and repair the car, all these different stops to grab a hold of healing items as well as repellent for the impending zombie infections within you, and all these weapons, armor, and upgrades, and all these different things, there's just a good amount of elements to help complex it to the point where it definitely feels like a more complicated thing. We obviously know that getting from point A to point B is a challenge in and of itself, but all these other things sure do make for a unique challenge. And just think, Chris Condon, he basically started off on PC and Flash Adobe style gaming, But now the fact that he's progressing to actual console-based gaming like most of us have, going on the PS4 and PS5 and even Xbox, that's really something if you ask me. I sure am hoping that con artist games can do so much more than just exploit the zombie apocalypse in their own specific way. Maybe they could do something different? I don't really know. Whatever the case may be though, con artist games and Unity were able to do a really good job handling The Last Stand in its current state. And while the roguelike element seems to be a bit of a frustration factor in and of itself, I'd say that it does hold up well in its own unique way, and this overall allows me to give a pretty good scoring for The Last Stand Aftermath. I'd say it around 7.7 out of 10.1. So while it's not fantastic in its own right, I do feel that there probably is that certain unique feeling coming from a game like this with its roguelike elements as well as its RPG elements, all coming together to form a unique piece that for the time might have seemed simple, but actually proved to be quite a bit of a challenge. A challenge that ended up so hard for me that I just gave up and quit. Yeah. But I don't know. Looking back, I feel like that this probably was not as bad of an experience as I would have possibly recalled. Other than that, though, there's not much more for me to iterate here. So with that in mind, thank you for watching this piece of HJN Super Graphics, and I'll be back with some more of this stuff tomorrow.